Hey there, my name is Alex. I am the Silver Mont. And whilst I was running over my friend with a vehicle in a game the other day, I found myself thinking, there are a lot of Souls clones around, aren't there? Many bad ones, some good ones, some that even do parts better than, well, Souls do. Neo, for example, has a lot more depth to the combat than Dark Souls, even if it's lacking in other areas. But whilst there are plenty of medieval knights bashing each other in a fantasy setting, Souls clones, what about a shooter? A modern day sort of shooter? The nearest we've had, that I can think of, would be the third person shooter Remnant from the Ashes, which functions vaguely like how you would imagine Dark Souls might as a third person shooter, and therefore might be useful in a video like this. For the sake of comparison, there was also that Square Enix game that came out, Outriders, which wasn't really much like it, but I thought someone might bring it up, so there you go. Incidentally, Remnant was a fun game. It was one of those solid sort of 7 out of 10, fun for a weekend kind of games. I have a full review up on the channel if you're interested. But maybe you're thinking, well, why third person? Why not first person? In my opinion, the growth and evolution of your character is an important part of the Souls games. Just look at how many people are into fashion Souls, Elden Bling, whatever, or showing off their fancy weapons. Second of all, well, what is it we expect from a third-person shooter, and what is it that we expect from Souls? Can the two work together? Is there some common ground there? Well, if you ask me, what players expect from a Souls game would be, in no particular order, challenging bosses, satisfying combat, a beautiful world to explore with interconnected and intricately designed levels, with a story that takes a backseat but has plenty of flavour and atmosphere, along with cooperative and competitive aspects. Finally, a wider range of ways to build your character and make them distinct. Some of these are a natural fit for a shooter, the levels, co-op and competitive aspects most of all. The only thing I really see being challenging would be the bosses in character building. After all, bosses in first or third person shooters can easily run into the issue of just feeling like a bullet sponge, and coming across as not very fun. Of course, some exceptions exist. Destiny has some very fun raid bosses, as a first-person shooter, for example. I have an idea for how the setting could work though, either in a fictional near-Earth reality or our own world, set in a stylized version of an old Central European country with big cities, Germany, for example, so you can have a bit of that Gothic architecture and atmosphere in places. The basic premise being that our character finds themselves in the middle of an armed conflict, the country the game is set in being invaded by another military force. It wouldn't be clear which side your character is on if they were on either side, meaning that's all up to you. You could have been one of the invaders who got knocked out, you could have been one of the defenders who got knocked out, or you could just be a tourist who got knocked out. Either way, you wake up and you're confused. The backstory for your character, of course, that's all up to you. In a way, you could think of the end of Shadows Die Twice, when Ashina is being invaded, as a loose sort of reference there. Character creation would work in much the same way it does in Souls. You choose a background for your character that determines your starting equipment, primarily. But starting class also determines your stats, right? How do we work stats and leveling up in a third-person shooter? Well, we need to avoid anything that would just make the game feel awful to play, such as accuracy, stats that make you randomly miss if you don't level them up enough. No thank you. Instead, stats should be more for using and scaling with equipment. Same as usual then. Heavier weapons and equipment needing more endurance or strength, for example. As for equipment, well, we could have a range of firearms and some melee, allowing the player to equip, let's say, 2 firearms and 1 melee at all times. These firearms wouldn't be Borderlands-style millions of guns either, instead having a range of, I don't know, let's say 15, 20 guns, more in the style of, for example, Doom. From there you increase the strength of your favourite guns and customise them in the process. Whilst it might make gun experts have a seizure, we could also have aesthetic changes, such as, I don't know, turning your AK-47 style assault rifle into an M16 style. They would function the same but have different looks and sounds. It's one possible option, or you could just have, multiple ones in the same class, like how you have the longsword and the broadsword in Dark Souls. You could have the AK and the M16 as two similar weapons in the same class, but with small differences here and there. As for melee weapons and combat, it would be used about as much as ranged weapons are in Dark Souls, primarily if an enemy gets too close for special attacks and counters. You know how Resident Evil 5 and 6 handle melee? Think something like that. Enemies would have a posture gauge that, when broken, allows for special attacks. Most of the game's combat would be fairly close range nature, and when an enemy's broken, shooting them would still do bonus damage, but you have the option to go up and do like a special melee attack. Likewise, when enemies get too close and do an attack, you'd have the option to counter, hitting a button at the right time to avoid being hit and doing a counter strike. A lot like how Resident Evil 6's counters work, just a little smoother than those ones. More satisfying. What about special attacks though? Well, whether or not magic should feature is a topic I'm undecided on, but I think firearms would largely fulfill the same role, so if magic were in, it should be in the form of a special or ultimate attack that you can build up over time and use infrequently. Maybe every boss drops a different special magic attack and you can choose one or two at a time and that's your ultimate. Special attacks though, certainly we should have those. Either with different weapons having different weapon arts we could equip to them, or having them be entirely separate from your weapons. Say you were equipped with a pistol and a sniper rifle, but your special move was an attack where you charge forward into a shotgun blast for high posture damage. Well, personally I think it would be better for them to tie into the weapons, so not every weapon could use the same art, and for example you couldn't use a shotgun ability with a pistol, but long arm weapons for example could share some. And weapons and clothing and armour you would find likewise impact your mobility and dodging speed. 2 heavy weapons, 1 heavy, 1 light, 2 light, same sort of thing, but we need to make sure in this sort of hypothetical situation that heavy builds aren't kind of invalidated as they often are in Dark Souls, where they just kind of get completely dunked on by light armor and light mobility in general. Co-op would make sense, and invasions could likewise make sense in this setting, but we could also have a completely separate PvP mode too. What about things like respawning upon death? Well, that necessitates some supernatural elements, or a very high technology. So which do we go with? Alien invasion that interrupts the war, somehow gives our character the ability to respawn when he's caught up in it somehow? Like Edge of Tomorrow, aka Live Die Repeat, aka All You Need Is Kill? Maybe eldritch machinations causing the war from behind the scenes. I don't know, maybe one of the countries had some super high-tech thing that lets you respawn when you die, lets you rebuild your body after you get blown up. Alternate realities starting to phase into each other, and our character's death instead results in him hopping into another self from another dimension, pulling in another version of himself, like D4C from Steel Ball Run. Well, either way, it could be part of the story that is revealed gradually through snippets here and there, but we would need a loose goal. I think either escaping the city the conflict is taking place in, or making your way to the source of what caused your character to change, would be fine. As a basic starting goal. We can say that whatever made the character respawn also allows them to harvest legally distinct souls to level up with. Either way, I think it's important to have mechanics make sense within the context of the world, not like, what was it? Lords of the Fallen back in 2014, where you just respawn for some reason. Hell, if we went with the alternate dimensions idea, maybe other players are doing the same thing and that's how co-op and invasions work. But how about bosses? That's the harder part. The crucial part is, I think, to avoid having them turn into overly scripted and bullet sponge bosses. Like how many bosses in Resident Evil turn out, for example. I don't hate the bosses in those games, but they are, well, overly scripted and way too bullet spongy. Now, of course, you can sort of skip some of that scripting if you brute force them. If you bring in a RPG or a Magnum, you can sort of skip them and just insta-kill them. But, well, it makes sense with those games having bullet sponges because they're zombies and monsters and bioweapons. I can't stand it in a game where you're fighting humans, you sneak up on a boss, blast the back of the boss's skull with a shotgun, he turns around like, okay, cool, thanks for stroking me, now die. Shorter chaotic fights that can be over in moments are superior, in my opinion, for pacing. Though there's nothing to say we couldn't have some giant bosses too here and there, or vehicle bosses that might make sense for the more durable ones. Like maybe you have to take out a giant enemy tank, a crab tank as a matter of fact. Maybe you have to destroy an enemy rail gun, which is literally a gun on rails, and you have to destroy it piece by piece, taking out some of the components. I don't know. As for non-combat stuff, well, exploration of the city, of course, would play a big angle, and getting that level right would be one of the most important parts. And naturally, we need NPCs to help and hinder us with their own agendas and quests and storylines. Honestly, I think a game like this could work well at delivering the important, key ingredients of what makes a Souls game satisfying. Remnant was fun, but I'd love to see more people, more developers giving this sort of game idea a tackle. Because I'm a huge fan of games having such organic, non-scripted feels to them, and I'm really fond of the way storytelling and world design is handled in these games. So I would love to see some in branching out gameplay scenarios. What do you think though? Let me know down in the comments.